My indeed profound thanks to the members of the Institute for my induction as a fellow, all the more so on the basis of that seminally insightful citation. In my reply, therefore, taking my departure from the citations highlighting of the concept cultures imagining, reimagining human subjects, I thought I would summarize the major points of a new hypothesis with respect to that concept. One that I'm in the process of putting forward in my still ongoing introduction to a collection of my essays, the majority of which were originally published in the Institute's Jamaica Journal. Now, the first point has to do with the proposal put forward by the distinguished West Indian historian Elsa Gobaya, this in a path-breaking 1970 essay, that a fundamental result of the 1930s native labor uprisings which had taken place in Jamaica and across the West Indies, and thereby set the stage for anti-colonial political democratization, had been the following: that for the first time we suddenly find, on the part of writers and artists, a flowering, ardent West Indian culture which seems to be tied to the sudden change which was taking place in the West Indian's conception of her himself. Furthermore, in order to make this new conception more real, in effect, to attempt to reimagine ourselves no longer as inferiorized native subjects we had formerly been made to experience ourselves to be, but instead as normal human subjects in now culturally inclusive terms, we had all done so on the basis of a specific aesthetic reorientation. This was that of their hour heretically turning towards the very local cultural Afro-West Indian, Afro-Jamaican attributes which had been despised and devalued within the culture-specific liberal humanist terms instituting of the British colonial system in its then overtly imperial configuration. Thus, the major prescription of this counter aesthetics were therefore these. Firstly, that the writers and artists would now utilize in our writing the Afro-English, Afro-West Indian Creole language. Secondly, by also making our stories about the West Indies, thereby giving centrality instead to people of dark complexion. With these thereby serving most fundamentally of all to establish that the fact of blackness was not a fact of inferiority. This, of course, as it continues to be, if now more mutedly so, in the overall West, globally hegemonic, purely secular, thereby dazzlingly techno-natural scientific, liberal humanist world system. Itself, as the first such planetarily extended world system in our human history, from our origin as, in the recent terms of the paleontologist José Luis Arzuaga, a uniquely languaging, storytelling, and as such hybridly nature-culture species on the continent of Africa. Specifically also, as this origin has been recently further proven to be by Western researchers, scientists, as well as linguists, to be cited in the geographic borderland region between Namibia and Angola, one whose overall extension as Southern Africa also, of course, includes the only recently ex-apartheid South Africa. Thus the paradox that it was Govaya's proposed aesthetic conceptual imperative, that of helping to establish that the fact of blackness is not a fact of inferiority, and thereby that the fact of whiteness is not a fact of superiority, which on the basis of the above recent findings have made possible for me the following recognition. This is that the above hitherto held to be, in Darwinian terms, naturally selected, deselected, and or dysgenic bell curve style facts are instead, in both cases, facts of cultural normalcy on the one hand, and of cultural alterity or human otherness on the other, with both thereby serving to enact the code of symbolic life and death that is itself instituting of the contemporary West's culturally imagined human subjects. This together with the latter's order of consciousness, itself integrating of each such human subjects always already symbolically encoded, thereby inter-altruistically kin recognizing referent we's, this together with their societal order or world. Now, although the West sees its own liberal humanist, thereby bourgeois culture, together with the latter's imagining of the human subject as economic man, or Homo economicus, as not being a culture at all, but reality itself, the noted U.S. cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz had as early as 1985 pointed out the following. This was that the West needs above all to recognize that it itself is but one local example of the forms human life has taken. That is, a case among cases, a world among worlds. That therefore it should be the general office of interpretive anthropology to keep reteaching this fugitive truth as it has to do with Western culture itself. Nevertheless, as the science studies scholar Bruno Latour has also enabled us to see, the problem with anthropology itself is that although Western anthropologists have indeed been able, from their own outsider perspective, to identify in objective terms the cultural constitution with a capital C, which is both imagining and instituting of all such other local forms of life, these very same anthropologists have hitherto remained unable to do so with respect to their own culture's constitution with a capital C. This is self-given that Western anthropologists, as themselves also culturally imagined human subjects, together with their referent we's, it's us, not us, must also know their own cultural order of reality, as all other humans must also know theirs, in the terms of what the U.S. pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty has identified as truths of solidarity. That is, truths instituting of the forms of solidarity indispensable to the stable, non-entropic reproduction of each such order's human subjects, their referent we's, modes of the us, not us, together with their respective societal worlds. The imperative question here is therefore this: how can we be enabled to move outside the limits of the truths of solidarity indispensable to the enacting of the now globally hegemonic and homogenized Western culture, thereby be enabled to know the reality of the culture of which we ourselves are always already culturally encoded and institutedly imagined human subjects, together with our respective referent we's, not us, and doing so outside its circularly culture-specific truth of solidarity, even more so outside its societally integrating order of consciousness as itself instituted by this very truth. The final point of my new hypothesis is therefore the following: that it was to be precisely the above dilemma that Aimé Césaire, himself a poet and also a West Indian, Antillean in Francophone terms, had first put forward in a 1946 talk in Haiti entitled Poetry and Knowledge. The proposal, that is, of a new and now hybrid science. The latter as one in whose new terms he emphasizes, it will now be the study of the word. That is the study of each culture's uniquely human code of symbolic life and death. That will now determine the study of nature. The study, therefore, of, as I shall add here, our cultural codes' activation in symbolic life-death terms of the human brain's behavior regulatory neurochemical system. Then, in the same context, several decades later, the physicist Heinz Pagel, writing in his 1988 book, The Dream of Reason, The Computer and the Science of Complexity, was also to propose an analogically hybrid new, i.e. culture-nature science, to that of Césaire's. As he wrote, I believe that the most dramatic impact of the new sciences will be to narrow the gap between the natural and the human world. For as we come to grasp the management of complexity, the rich structures of symbols, and perhaps consciousness itself, it is clear that the traditional barriers erected on both sides between the natural sciences and the humanities, cannot forever be maintained. Narrative order of culturally constructed worlds, the order of human feelings and beliefs, will become subject to scientific description in a new way, just as it did during the Italian Renaissance. A new image of humanity will emerge in the future as science and art interact in their complementary spheres.